Greetings, everyone. Happy Halloween. I figured I'd make a video to tell you guys another story from Colonial America. But given the nature of this holiday, we're going to tell something that's a little gruesome and scary. Just a warning, you might not want your kids to hear this story. So if you're parents, you may want to screen this first and then decide whether or not you'd like your kids to hear this. Okay, so this is a true story. It's from history. It's from Colonial America, and Colonial America was a gruesome place sometimes. So you've been warned. I'm going to start telling the story in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so if you're still here, I'm assuming you want to hear the story. So I grew up, in the 80s and the 90s watching horror movie villains like Freddy Krueger and Michael Myers. We didn't have, a lot of comic book movies back then, so we didn't have an Avengers. We had, horror movie villains, particularly the slashers. So I grew up watching some pretty gory, crazy things. But truth seems to always be stranger than fiction. And so this is a story that I read. I was reading a book by a historian named Richard White, and he wrote a book called The Middle Ground, which is basically a history of the Great Lakes region and the indigenous people that lived there. And I had to read this when I was working on my master's degree, and then I had to read it again when I was working on my PhD. So this is a pretty important book in the historiography of American Indians and Colonial America. And it focuses on the Great Lakes region. And so we have, several Algonquin groups, and then we also have several Iroquoian-speaking groups. And then, of course, most notably, out of those Iroquoian-speaking peoples are the 5 nations that are the Iroquois Confederacy. So the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas. And these 5 nations, the Iroquois Confederacy, fight a war with pretty much all of their Indian neighbors and those Indian neighbors' French allies that have been called the Beaver Wars, or sometimes they're just called the Iroquois Wars. But it was a long series of brutal wars, and it broke a lot of Indian nations. These Iroquois, they were pretty powerful people, and it was not uncommon for Indians in the eastern woodlands to torture captives. That was fairly common, regardless of whether they were Iroquoian or Siouan or Algonquin or whatever. But there was definitely a culture in the eastern woodlands where prisoners could be tortured. And I want to make it clear that this wasn't just out of cruelty. There was a sort of a religious or spiritual aspect to this. But it doesn't, change the fact that some people experienced some pretty brutal deaths at the hands of Indians in the eastern woodlands. But this particular story that I read about in The Middle Ground is something I've never forgotten. I've read a lot of accounts of different, experiences where people were tortured to death. And there's some pretty gruesome ones, but the most gruesome that I've probably ever read came from this book, The Middle Ground. And what happened here in the midst of these Iroquois wars, or these Beaver Wars, a group of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Senecas, had went into a village of the Miamis. And most of the Miami men were gone. They'd actually went out as a war party and left the village fairly defenseless. And the Senecas came in and pretty much killed the adults that were there, and they took all the children captive. And so the Miamis come back to their village, and the children are gone. and they go in pursuit of the Senecas. And this is where the story gets really disturbing, because the Senecas, as they're being pursued by the Miamis, every night when they make camp, they eat one of the Miami children. And so they eat a Miami child, and they leave the child's head on a spike facing the direction of the Miamis, which would be to the west. And so, because they know they're being pursued by these Miamis. So each day as the Miamis continue on the trail of these Senecas, they find a child's head, which is one of their children. So every day one of these Miami warriors sees the head of a child that they knew, and they knew that this child had been eaten. And many times it would have been their child. And this goes on for, quite a while, day after day after day after day. And eventually the Miamis are able to catch up with these Senecas and fight them, and they capture several of them. And of course they do similar atrocities to these Senecas. So they behead several of them, but they leave a couple of them alive. And the two that they leave alive, they tie the heads of the other Senecas to these two living captives. And then with the living captives, who are now wearing the heads of their comrade, they cut off their lips and their noses and their hands, and they send them back to the Senecas as sort of a warning. So this is just one account of what happened in these beaver wars. But things like this happened all over the eastern woodlands, and it happened between Indian groups, and it happened between Indians and Europeans, and it was vicious. It was a brutal place to live on the frontier. And that story has always been disturbing to me, and it's definitely gruesome. It's not something that's it's not fun like horror movies that we might watch. The horror movies are fun because they're pretend, right? They're actors. But this was a very real account of something that happened in North America, and it's crazy. So sometimes we seem to forget how vicious the American landscape was. Sometimes we like to have very fond and politically correct memories of people in the past, and it's not always the case. So I hope that didn't ruin your day, but it's a scary story, but it is an interesting story from a historical perspective. So happy Halloween, and I'll see you guys next time.